Hello, and welcome to season 5 of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I'm so thrilled you are with us this year. We are going to speak to some historians, to speak to some authors, to look at ways that the stories of history, his story, her story, their story, and our stories come together to demonstrate the ways that history shows us what's possible. I'm so grateful to have you joining me in this journey through the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics of history. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am here with a new colleague and friend, Darren Freebury-Jones, who's going to join us and take us really behind the scenes with Shakespeare and how he created all of his plays. So welcome, Darren.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and so lovely to see you again.
Yes, we were able to connect while I was in Stratford earlier. And so it's great to continue the conversation we were having there. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. Now, I want to start by just asking, what was your journey to Shakespeare? I've sort of surrounded myself with my little Shakespeare on my shoulder here and some other things. I have your book in my hand to talk about, but tell us about your journey to Shakespeare.
I love that. Yes, you've got a puppet Shakespeare behind you, on your shoulder, a good
on my
angel,
shoulder.
I think. Yes, yes. My journey to Shakespeare. I was thinking about this earlier. What was my first encounter with Shakespeare, even indirectly? And quite an early memory for me was being at the cinema, and it was the closing credits of The Lion King. And I remember as a child having tears in my eyes and turning around and seeing all of the people in rows behind me with tears in their eyes as well. And little did I know, and I didn't realize until many years later, that, of course, The Lion King is considered something of an adaptation of Hamlet. And it's really clever. Of course, you've got something of a revenge tragedy going on there, a murderous uncle, but then you've also got Hakuna Matata, so a sense of stoicism, Roman Senecan stoicism that, of course, we see in Hamlet as well. But my first direct contact with Shakespeare was probably at high school. So I went to a school in Wales, where I'm from, that was voted the second worst school in Wales. Which was really disappointing for us all as students, because we actually thought we would have a chance of winning something for once. But either way, second worst school in Wales, that's where I first encountered Julius Caesar. And several years later, to mark the first Shakespeare play I ever studied, I actually had a speech from that play tattooed on my chest. So were it not for Shakespeare, and were it not for Julius Caesar, at the very least, my left breast would look quite different, I think. Now, I think it was at college that I really got the bug, because I had a fantastic teacher, and we were studying King Lear, arguably Shakespeare's bleakest tragedy, a very dense play, quite difficult to tackle for a 16-year-old, but I loved it. I absolutely loved King Lear. And yet when I went to university, I was studying all sorts of different topics, such as Victorian literature, critical theory, and I think it's fair to say that I knew Foucault about critical theory. It was not really my strong suit. I preferred the tangible, but also Shakespeare. And I then ended up doing an MA on Shakespeare and plays attributed to him. So the so-called Shakespeare Apocrypha. Then I did the PhD on Shakespeare and his relationship with an Elizabethan playwright named Thomas Kidd. So I kind of looked back at those years and thought, well, how did I get here? How did I end up being a Shakespeare specialist? And I remember bumping into someone I knew at college who I didn't get on with at college whatsoever. And it was the first time I saw this individual in about a decade. And, you know, we weren't connected on social media, shall we say. And he said, oh, I remember you from college, Shakespeare boy. And suddenly all these memories came flooding back that this was a nickname I had had for quite a long time in college and through university. So spending all that time thinking, what is my bag? What is my particular avenue I'm interested in? Well, it must have always been Shakespeare. Shakespeare must have always been figuring in conversations with me. So I've been boring people about Shakespeare ever since.
Well, as a Shakespeare boy would. I mean, that seems quite fitting. Well, so and now tell us about the Institute and your relationship with Stratford and all of that as well. So that continues. The Shakespeare connection continues.
Yes, yes. So I work in Stratford upon Avon now, and I've been in Stratford since 2018. So I remember first coming to Stratford upon Avon. It's a bit like a kid in a sweet shop if you're a Shakespeare lover, because, well, Shakespeare's everywhere, particularly in statue form. He's monumentalized and revivified in statue form. And one of my favorite statues is near the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, where Shakespeare's standing on a plinth with some of his most famous characters surrounding him, such as Hamlet striking the pose of looking into the hollow sockets of Yorick's skull, and Lady Macbeth washing her hands, and so forth. And we think of a film like Romeo and Juliet, for example, where that statue comes to life in that film and speaks in the voice of Patrick Stewart. And I do often find myself looking up at that statue, and Patrick Stewart's voice has yet to speak to me, unfortunately. But it's wonderful because it's a small market town, but it's also a hugely popular tourist destination and a historical site. And I get to engage with people from all over the world, visiting groups. I spend a lot of time giving lectures to people from anywhere between the ages of 14 or 94. So leisure learners, school groups, university students, teachers as well. So it's every day is just a joy, really.
It sounds wonderful. And I do remember my first time in Stratford. And yes, like a kid in a candy shop, and everywhere I looked, you just wander down a street and there he is somehow, either in a tea shop named after him or whatever. He's everywhere. And so it is wonderful.
And even on the river, you've got lots of boats named after his plays. And you've also got one boat, which is titled War and Peace, which I find really interesting as a kind of conflation of different literary traditions.
That's great. Oh, I do like that. Well, okay. So you have this strong background and you have created, let me hold it up correctly, Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers. So tell us about this, because it's an allusion to something of Robert Greene. So we'll talk about that. But what drew you to this topic to pursue and figure out all of these relationships among Shakespeare and his contemporaries?
Yeah, so I've always had an interest in Shakespeare's contemporaries, and it probably stems in large part to my third year at university in Cardiff. And we were looking at a collaborative play called The Book of Sir Thomas More. And there's about 5 authors involved in that play. And we think Shakespeare is one of them. And I just found it interesting looking at the ways in which authors' voices differed and how they were all bringing different things to the table in this collaborative enterprise. And of course, collaboration was a perfectly normal way of putting a play together during Shakespeare's time, because it was a business operation, and you can therefore service that business operation and produce play scripts quickly. So I then ended up doing the PhD looking at Shakespeare's relationship with Thomas Kyd. Kyd probably most famous for writing The Spanish Tragedy, which is the first revenge tragedy, where you've got elements like a ghost seeking revenge, murder in an orchard, a play within a play used for vengeful purposes. These are all elements Shakespeare later recycles in Hamlet. So several years after completing the PhD, I then wrote a book on Thomas Kyd. And while waiting for the green light from the publisher, it took quite a long time to get that green light. And I thought, I'm very interested in Robert Greene, who has a rather negative reputation, shall we say, because he infamously referred to Shakespeare as an upstart crow. So rather than twiddling my thumbs, I then wrote a book about Robert Greene over a period of around 6 months, and usually during the nights when the family had gone to bed. And then it was in the space of about a week, I got the green light for both books. So I was working on both books at the same time, including doing the indexing myself. And I thought, I've written a book on Thomas Kidd. I've written a book on Robert Greene. Why not write a book on everybody? But I'm being a little bit facetious there, but Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers is an exploration of how Shakespeare interacted with, was influenced by, and in some instances collaborated with major dramatists during the course of his career. So going back to the 1580s and a writer chiefly known for comedy named John Lilly, all the way to around 1613 when Shakespeare retired, and he's co-writing plays with a younger dramatist named John Fletcher.
Right. And you see his career arc through all these people he's collaborated with over that period of time. And one of the things I was thinking about as I'm working on some history and some Shakespeare projects is I just gave a talk for Smithsonian not too long ago about the Wars of the Roses. And what we think we know about that series of battles, a lot of that comes from the way Shakespeare wrote about it and perpetuated a story about it. So much based necessarily in truth, but a good story, right? Don't let truth get in the way. But we do get glimpses into the history of the period through his plays in some ways, which I think is really interesting. So can you take us into his world, London in his day, and what that was like? Because you mentioned collaboration was part of the game. It wasn't where authors had this big copyright problem with their own work. There was a lot of collaboration and borrowing and borrowed feathers and all of that going on. So tell us about that.
I am a huge fan of the Henry VI plays, by the way, which I think get much less attention in terms of modern day performance and criticism than they should. I just think it's wonderful that dramatization of the conflict between the York and Lancaster houses. And I always refer to that trilogy as Game of Thrones minus the dragons and the disappointing season finale. But it was a hugely popular play genre history, actually. And one scholar estimates that around a third of surviving plays from that period feature battle scenes. So, of course, battles depicted on stage, that's hugely entertaining, just as action movies and historical epic films today are still popular. But yes, London during Shakespeare's time, you imagine him traveling from Stratford upon Avon with a population of around 12 to 1500 people. And he suddenly enters the capital city with a population of around 180,000 people. And it's been estimated that during Shakespeare's time, around 15 to 20% of Londoners went to the theatre. So this was a hugely popular form of entertainment. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a business enterprise. We think of the works of Shakespeare as great literature, and some people might consider them a bit highbrow. But during Shakespeare's time, plays weren't seen as works of art in quite the same way as poetry, like Shakespeare's sonnets were. So this is a business operation designed to entertain, engage audiences, and with any kind of business operation, you're going to have competitors. So you've got so many different playing companies of the period putting on different dramas, and there's also alternative forms of entertainment. So if you don't fancy going to see a play, you might go and see someone getting executed. So for a penny, which would fetch you a loaf of bread, you can go watch someone getting hanged, beheaded, or maybe even hanged, drawn, and quartered, if you're that way inclined. You could also go and see the cruel blood sport of bear baiting. So you're watching a bear getting attacked by a pack of dogs. Sometimes they didn't use a bear, they used a bull. So you've got audiences watching a bull getting attacked by a pack of dogs. And we know on a couple of occasions they didn't use a bear, they didn't use a bull, they strapped a chimpanzee to a horse's saddle. And people found it highly entertaining watching this poor monkey clinging on for dear life. So that tells you a little bit about what audiences found entertaining during Shakespeare's time. And it evokes connotations of the Colosseums as well, I think. And I think Shakespeare is a dramatist. He tries to cater to that. He says, oh, you're interested in, you know, the grotesque, you're interested in death. Come to an early tragedy of mine like Titus Andronicus. You'll see 14 deaths during the course of that play. And as an entertainment industry as well, we often complain that there's a lack of originality in media today. So one forthcoming film, for example, Snow White, has had a lot of criticism. But when it came to drama during the period, it wasn't necessarily about telling new stories, but about telling existing stories in innovative ways. And you'll often find that playing companies are trying to duplicate the popular offerings of their competitors. And we certainly see that in the history play genre in particular. So you'll have a play about Richard III springing up by one playing company, and within the same year, you'll find at least one or two other plays on that subject. So dramatists and playing companies are very conscious of what's proving popular with audiences. And seeing it as an entertainment industry, I think, is a really useful way of approaching these 400-year-old plays.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's almost like TV today, or a reality TV kind of thing, that you see one show takes off and then the next season there are two or three that look an awful lot like that one show that took off. Suddenly we have lots of cop dramas or lots of hospital dramas because it's just popular entertainment. You're looking for the numbers. And it was like that. They weren't looking for, oh, let's write something that'll last 400 years and be thought of as fine literature. They were trying to sell tickets and make money.
Because we don't really get a turning point in terms of how plays are perceived until 1616. And that's not to be credited to Shakespeare, it's to be credited to his fellow playwright and friend Ben Jonson, because he suddenly starts referring to his plays as works, the works of Benjamin Jonson. And he actually got a lot of stick for that at the time. So you had a poet named John Suckling saying of Ben Jonson, he deserves the bays, for his were called works, while others were but plays.
Right. So it's a whole, and it takes a while before that's taken seriously and they really become works. So if we're looking at something like the history plays that so many people are working on, who are some of the other playwrights that we might have heard of or seen? You mentioned Robert Greene, and I'm a big fan of Upstart Crow, which I find hilarious. It's not, it's not a documentary. It's not accurate. But I do think it's funny that the character of Robert Greene outlives the real Robert Greene to continue in that series for a long time. So you mentioned Robert Greene. Can you tell us a little more about him and some of the other playwrights and others in Shakespeare's world that are interacting with him in these interesting ways?
Yes, I love Upstart Crow. And even last night, I was watching it before bed, and my partner often says, "Don't you ever get bored? You work on Shakespeare all day, and then you're watching Shakespeare entertainment at night." But I love Mark Heap's interpretation of him as this fusty university figure, and I like the way he emphasizes the last syllables of certain words, which comes across as very archaic. It's a wonderful interpretation. So a lot of your listeners might be familiar with Robert Greene through Ben Elton's sitcom Upstart Crow. There's a very famous woodcut engraving of him from 1598, suited in death's livery, where he kind of looks like he's wearing the equivalent of an early modern slanket. It's a really interesting image of him. But he has been called the first professional writer in England. So he was prolific in terms of producing pamphlets, poetry, and also in terms of producing drama. And it's really interesting when it comes to drama that we might think that those early plays are quite conservative in terms of genre, that you've got your tragedies, you've got your comedies and so forth, and then it branches out as drama progresses. But that's not the case. Dramatists right from the off were experimenting with conflating different genres. And you'll often find with Robert Greene in plays such as The Scottish History of James IV, which, just as a caveat for historically inclined listeners, is not really a history play at all. It's a romance play, and it's not historically accurate whatsoever, but it's got a conclusion that seems dramatically unhappy. You've got a murderous king wants his wife dead so he can court another woman, and then they're reunited at the end of the play. So according to the comedy genre, you've got your happy resolution there, people brought back together, but scratch away at the surface as you leave the theatre and you think, oh, I wonder what a sequel to that play might look like. Well, how's that relationship going to go? And we think of those kind of problematic endings as Shakespearean. We think of plays like Measure for Measure, for example, but Greene was there decades before, and Greene was hugely entertaining as a playwright. So he loves taking advantage of special effects. You'll have gods descending from the rafters in plays like Alphonsus, King of Aragon, or characters being struck by thunderbolts in his biblical play, A Looking Glass for London and England. So he is one of the university-educated playwrights on the scene as Shakespeare makes his entrance, if you like. And there seems to have been something of a tension between the so-called university wits. So Robert Greene and other playwrights like Christopher Marlowe, for example. And you've got Shakespeare, who, so far as we know, is not university educated. He is an actor. And we have a pamphlet attributed to Robert Greene called Greene's Groat's Worth of Wit, Bought with a Million of Repentance, published in 1592. And this is the first reference to Shakespeare as an actor dramatist in London. And it's fundamentally a bad review. So Greene calls Shakespeare an upstart crow, beautified in our feathers. He's warning fellow university educated playwrights against actors, those puppets, I mean, that speak from our mouths. And one actor in particular, because Shakespeare, or Shakespeare, lots of dodgy puns in pamphlets during the period, has had the audacity to turn his hand to writing plays, despite not having a university education. Now, some people think this is an accusation of plagiarism. I don't tend to go along with that. I think there were lots of discussions when it came to literary proprietorship. It's always a bit of a mouthful, that word, for me. What constitutes imitation? When does emulation stray too far? But I think what's ruffling Greene's feathers is that Shakespeare, having acted in the plays of better educated contemporaries, he knows what works and what doesn't work on stage. And he's used to delivering their dramatic language for himself. And you do find with Shakespeare's earliest plays that sometimes they read like patchworks of phrases that you'll also find in the earlier works of the likes of Christopher Marlowe, the likes of Thomas Kyd, for example. And I think that's just natural. And a lot of it might have been unconscious on Shakespeare's part, because as an actor, he's deeply rooted in the theatrical vernacular of the period. And also as an actor, he needs an incredible memory. So actors might be performing multiple plays 6 days a week with only a few weeks for rehearsal, and all they've got are cue scripts. So they've got their own lines and just a couple of words from preceding speeches. So I think you get a sense of Shakespeare's incredible memory, and also his listening ability, his aural skills as well, right from the start of his career.
So as an actor, he has a unique window into, as you say, what works on stage, what brings people back, what gets audiences excited. And then he can use that, and other playwrights maybe don't have that option, having not been actors. So
Yeah.
some of these plays have sort of an actor's eye. Some of Shakespeare's plays have an actor's eye in the way that the play is structured then, right?
Or an actor's ear. And I think
Yeah,
another
yeah, that's better.
advantage for I think another advantage for Shakespeare as his career progresses is a lot of dramatists are working freelance. They're jumping from company to company. Whereas Shakespeare, from 1594 onwards, he sticks with the same company, which is the Lord Chamberlain's Men from 1594. And then when King James I comes to the throne, becomes the King's Men in 1603. So he knows his fellow actors intimately. He knows their strengths, he knows their limits. So when we think of a leading male role in Shakespeare's canon, the likes of Hamlet, the likes of Macbeth, for instance, they probably would have been played by Shakespeare's star actor Richard Burbage, very much the Daniel Craig or Zac Efron of the period. An incredible actor who was renowned for drawing tears from audience members and for being a real protean talent. He can play Hamlet around 1600, young Hamlet, 30 years old, and then 5 years later, he's playing 80-year-old King Lear. So a phenomenal talent, but you'll very rarely find roles that Richard Burbage is believed to have played breaking into song. So he doesn't seem to have been a great talent in terms of singing. I don't think he'd be auditioning for the X Factor if he was alive in modern times. And sometimes Shakespeare's so aware of the actor playing the role in his plays that you'll get the actor's name rather than the character name. So there's a famous example in an edition of Romeo and Juliet where you get the stage direction, enter Will Kemp. So Shakespeare's comic clown, as opposed to enter Peter, the role in that play. So I think that really helps Shakespeare get the best out of his characters and also get the best out of his actors, because as an actor himself, he knows what makes for a meaty role.
Yes, and it is interesting. You can see that in some of the plays, and then the fools, that character changes when a different fool comes into the company after Will Kemp leaves, right? I mean, the parts of the fool are different toward the end.
There's a huge transformation. So 1599, Will Kemp, who is largely known for playing country bumpkins or rustic zany. So think Bottom, who famously turns into an ass in A Midsummer Night's Dream, or the Constable Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing. Now he leaves Shakespeare's company and famously Morris dances the 125 miles from London to Norwich, which is quite the exit, I think. And then you've got Shakespeare's comedy As You Like It in 1599, where we're suddenly introduced to a completely different kind of fool, a courtly fool named Touchstone, who he has a satiric wit and can be quite rancid at times. And he would have been played, we think, by Robert Armin, who is just a completely different kind of comic talent to Kemp.
Yes, I just think that's really interesting and reminds us that Shakespeare was very much writing in a time and place with people coming in and out of that company and adapting to that. So as we see the way he's writing and we see possible collaborations, and then we see, of course, he's had an impact on others as well. And so you mentioned Upstart Crow as sort of a modern telling of Shakespeare. And I want to ask about another modern telling, which is Shakespeare in Love, which makes much of the character of Christopher Marlowe or Kit Marlowe. So can you tell us, because there's a relation, and actually he shows up in Upstart Crow as well, but looking at Shakespeare in Love and that character, and you do see interaction with Shakespeare and other people. So can you talk a little bit about that part of our understanding of Shakespeare and, again, other people who are influencing Shakespeare?
I love Shakespeare in Love. I think it's such a wonderful historical retelling. It's so clever. And I always remember in my first year of lecturing at Stratford upon Avon, we had a school group come, and I was told I'd be lecturing to them on Romeo and Juliet. And we said, oh, it seems to be that the curriculum is titled Shakespeare in Love. And my manager said, oh, I've not heard of that one before. So I walked into the room prepared to give a talk on Romeo and Juliet, and the teacher stopped me and said, oh no, it's actually on the movie Shakespeare in Love. So they were seeking a lecture on it. Now, at that point, I hadn't seen Shakespeare in Love for many years, so I was reaching into the basement of my mind throughout. But the talk went very well, actually. But yes, a wonderful film. And you mentioned Christopher Marlowe, who's also a very prominent figure in Upstart Crow. And I think when we have a look at the available biographical evidence, Marlowe's life, though considerably shorter, seems to have been sexier than Shakespeare's. So he was born in Canterbury, Kent, and he was actually baptized exactly 2 months before Shakespeare, so the 26th of February 1564, and his father was a shoemaker. So Shakespeare's father was a glove maker, some interesting correspondences there. There's a difference, however, in that Marlowe goes to university. He goes to Cambridge, he gets his MA in 1587, but he almost doesn't get his MA because of frequent absences. And the government, the Privy Council, step in and say he's been away, not truanting, because he's been undertaking business benefiting the country. So a lot of scholars suspect that Marlowe was actually a spy. And his life and career as a playwright, as a poet, and maybe as a spy, were effectively racked and ruined on the 5th of May, 1593, because you then get a xenophobic poem posted on the walls of a Dutch church called Austin Friars, and it's calling for the murder of Protestant refugees. Now, you might remember there's a wonderful scene in Shakespeare in Love where Shakespeare meets Marlowe in the pub, and Marlowe asks him, what are you up to at the moment, Bill? And he says, oh, I'm working on a play I'm very excited about. It's called Romeo and Ethel, the pirate's daughter. What about you, Kit? And Marlowe just says, the massacre at Paris. And Shakespeare just lets out this envious sigh. But that xenophobic poem I mentioned references the St. Bartholomew Day massacre. And it's also signed Tamburlaine, which is the lead character in Marlowe's first London plays, Tamburlaine the Great, Part 1, and Tamburlaine the Great Part 2. So Tamburlaine the Great was so popular, Marlowe was commissioned to write a sequel. So this seems to have been something of a setup. We don't actually think Marlowe was responsible for this poem. But while awaiting a decision on his case by the Privy Council, on the 30th of May, 1593, he spends time with 3 men who have connections with the spy master, Francis Walsingham, or his cousin Thomas Walsingham. And during the course of, I believe they were there for around 10 hours. So it seems to have been a heavy drinking session, quite possibly. During the course of that stay, there's an argument over the reckoning, the bill. And Marlowe is stabbed above the right eye and apparently died swearing, which is how I would like to go, I think. So Marlowe exerted a huge influence on Shakespeare. Ben Jonson writes of Marlowe's mighty line. So there's a muscularity to his verse. It can come across as a bit ranty and a bit bombastic. And to go back to that pamphlet attributed to Robert Greene, Greene says that Shakespeare attempts to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you. Now, there's a great example in the Henry VI plays of Shakespeare emulating Marlowe right at the start of his career. And it occurs in the play known as Henry VI, Part 3. So you've got the depiction of the 1460 Battle of Wakefield. And you've got Margaret of Anjou, who I think is a tremendous character. And if you add all of her lines up in the three Henry VI plays and Richard III, actually the largest female role Shakespeare ever wrote. And she and her forces have captured York, who of course is trying to gain the crown for himself. And she makes him stand on a molehill, wear a paper crown, and bids him wipe his tears with a handkerchief smeared in the blood of his son Rutland. Moreover, she harangues him for over 40 lines. And having seen it in performance, it's such an edge of your seat moment, because you're waiting to see how York will respond. And he doesn't disappoint. He gives this wonderful, acerbic tirade, she-wolf of France, but worse than wolves of France, whose tongue more poisons than the adder's tooth. And in that speech, you get a line, "O tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide." Now, this speech seems to have ruffled the feathers of other playwrights in particular, because it's that line that is paraphrased in Greene's Groat's Worth of Wit as tiger's heart wrapped in a player's or an actor's hide. So you can see this ranty speech, that's very Marlowean, it's very bombastic, but Shakespeare is also quite distinct, even right at the start of his career. So university-educated playwrights like Christopher Marlowe tend to stick to the 10-syllable verse line. So 5 unstressed syllables, 5 stressed syllables. A lot of us, when we study Shakespeare in school, we're told that the rhythm resembles a heartbeat. De-dum, de-dum, de-dum. Others might say that's de-dumbing it down. Whereas Shakespeare, right from the bat, right from the start of his career, he starts playing around with it. He starts adding an 11th syllable, and he loves putting words together, so-called compound words like she-wolf, for example, which are quite rare in Marlowe's canon. So right at the beginning of his career, you can see Shakespeare, he is an imitative dramatist, but he's also doing something different with his inspirations, and they were all at it at the period. So Christopher Marlowe, for example, in the Tamburlaine plays, pretty much inserts a speech which is lifted from Edmund Spenser, from his Fairy Queen, I believe. So Shakespeare hugely influenced at the start of his career, but you also get a sense of Marlowe haunting him after his death. So we mentioned Touchstone in As You Like It earlier, and he gives a wonderful speech where he says, "When a man's verses cannot be understood, nor a man's good wit seconded with the forward child understanding, it strikes a man more dead than a great reckoning in a little room." So you suddenly got Marlowe, or the ghost of Marlowe, known chiefly as a tragic writer, haunting the Forest of Arden in Shakespeare's sparkling comedy of As You Like It. And we see it right at the end of Shakespeare's career as well. So the Marlowe play that most listeners might be familiar with is Dr. Faustus. So that tale of Faustus selling his soul so he can use the demon Mephistopheles to do his bidding for 24 years. And this is a magus, or so-called magician play. And it's a prerequisite of that genre that by the end of the magus play, the magician has to give up his magic powers. Now, Shakespeare's last solo author play is The Tempest, where you have effectively a wizard named Prospero on an enchanted island, and he gives up his magic arts at the end. He says, "I'll drown my book." Faustus, in Marlowe's much earlier play, says that he will burn his books. The difference is, unlike Prospero, Faustus has found himself in a tragedy, and it's simply too late for him to repent. So that was something really interesting I discovered with the book, was that Shakespeare often gazes wistfully into the past, and at Elizabethan playwrights like Christopher Marlowe, for example, and is much less imitative of fellow playwrights as his career progresses. So there's much less sense of him imitating the likes of Ben Jonson, or later playwrights like John Fletcher or Thomas Dekker, for example. So quite interesting, I think, just getting that sense of Shakespeare as a dramatist, frequently looking to the past and seeing what he can bring, what he can freshen up for modern day audiences.
Well, that's really interesting. If you think of the way, I mean, the past being not too long ago in some cases, but sometimes he goes way back for stories as well, you know, to bring those and use those to talk about actually what's happening at the time, because you can't talk about what's actually happening. So he has this sense of timelessness, I think, and bringing Marlowe, as you said, that haunting of Marlowe, the reckoning in a small room, which people would know then, if even if we don't so much see it immediately now, they would have seen it then. So that idea of past and presence and sort of the fluidity of that, I think, is really interesting. All of this brings me to sort of the big question at the end, which I think we've already hinted at. So we have these other playwrights that have had an influence on Shakespeare. He's borrowing from them, he's collaborating with them. And yet, primarily, even with someone else first calling the plays works, it's Shakespeare who's still the most well-known. It's Shakespeare who's still produced, they say every day all over the world, you can find a Shakespeare play in production. So why is it that certainly they've all lasted in some way, but why has Shakespeare lasted and continue to move audiences and drive new adaptations and be so relevant now to such a great extent? Why Shakespeare?
Why Shakespeare? I mean, that's a huge question.
That's why I came to you.
And that's why it's the last question. Why Shakespeare? I think I love your use of the word fluidity there. And I think that's part of it. Is it's become something of a cliche to say that Shakespeare is universal, or there's a universality to the themes he explores. But I think it helps that Shakespeare is an actor dramatist and he knows his audiences intimately. And his audiences were incredibly eclectic. So you might have plays performed in front of the monarchs before Queen Elizabeth and later King James. At the public playhouses, you might have foreign ambassadors, tailors, butchers, leather workers, but also thieves, also sex workers. So when you're writing a play for such a diverse audience, and for a venue like the Globe Theatre, which has a potential capacity of 3,000 people, you need to ensure that the stories you're telling and the themes you're exploring are resonant with as many different audience members as possible. And I think that contributes in part to why Shakespeare is still enjoyed and adapted today, because no matter what your socio-economic background and no matter what time period you're from, you will find something in a Shakespeare play that still speaks to you. But it's interesting when we think of the Restoration period. So, of course, the theatres closed down for quite a significant period, and then public performances resume in 1660. And during the Restoration period, there were dramatists such as Shakespeare's younger contemporary, John Fletcher, who were seen as more accessible, particularly in terms of their dramatic language. And there was a lot of emphasis placed on Ben Jonson's plays, because Restoration audiences really liked the fact that he saw himself as a classicist. So there's a lot of emphasis in Jonson's plays on neoclassical dramaturgy, so the unities of time, place, and action. So a play occurring in just one location over a period of around 3 to 4 hours, and not mingling plots and subplots and different genres. I mean, that's pretty much the opposite to Shakespeare, with a couple of exceptions in the Comedy of Errors and the Tempest. So during the Restoration periods, Shakespeare is recognized as a wonderful playwright, but also as one of several members of a broad and brilliant network of writers from the period. But then there seems to have been something of a shift where Shakespeare is recognized more for his poetic quality. Some of it might very well just tie into what was available in theatrical repertoires and what dramatists you could put on more frequently. But also, I think the fact that Shakespeare wasn't working freelance, that he wasn't jumping from company to company, the result is that most of his canon is preserved, and largely through the 1623 first folio. So there's only a couple of exceptions of what we believe to be lost Shakespeare plays, such as Love's Labour's One or Cardenio, mentioned during the period. So I think having that canon largely preserved by his fellow company members and his fellow actors, that means that Shakespeare is able to endure, whereas other playwrights who have significantly more lost works, I think they have less opportunity to stake a reputation than Shakespeare has.
That's a really good point. And we had Chris on to talk about Shakespeare's book and how all that was put together. So that really goes well with that. And the idea that, yes, he's been with this one company and knows these people, and they had a stake in preserving his work as well. And so that really makes sense. Okay. Thank you for answering the big question. Now I have just one more. So I tricked you a little. If you had to say your favorite Shakespeare play.
Yes.
What would that be? And I know that's hard.
It's very hard. I'm all about the tragedies. So I love Hamlet, King Lear. I think they're Shakespeare's greatest artistic achievements. If I was to use the word favourite in terms of, I just fancy a bit of escapism and just a little bit of dark fun. I'd probably say Titus Andronicus. Which I like to refer to as the Quentin Tarantino movie of the Shakespeare canon, because it's just bonkers. It's Shakespeare's first tragedy. It's got 14 deaths, as we mentioned earlier, and it features decapitation, mutilation, and it ends with a mother being tricked into eating her own sons, who have been baked in a pie. But one of the reasons why Titus Andronicus is only slightly facetiously my favorite Shakespeare play is that it's recognized as an early Shakespeare collaboration. So Shakespeare's co-writing Titus Andronicus with a very established university-educated playwright named George Peele, who did huge things for not only the tragedy genre, but also history. So he produced plays like Edward I and the Troublesome Reign of King John, without which we might not have Shakespeare's history plays, including much more famous examples such as Henry V, Richard II, Richard III, for example. So my interest in how Shakespeare engaged with other playwrights, it was partly spurred by studying Titus Andronicus. So that's my rather long-winded answer to that wonderful question.
I do love that, because that really, you don't see all of that play just in the play, but there's so much that's going on with it, and that I think is part of what you share with us here. There's so much else going on and so many other people involved. So thank you so much for taking us into this world that continues to haunt and delight and instruct us all these years later, and we can understand better. So tell us where we can get the book and where we can learn more about you.
So Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers. How Early Modern Playwrights Shaped the World's Greatest Writer. It's published by Manchester University Press, released on October 8th. You can buy it online via the Manchester University Press website, or the likes of W.H. Smith, Amazon, and all good bookshops. And if you're interested in learning a bit more about me, you might go to my Twitter/X profile, Freeburian, so Freeburian. And I'm also on other social media accounts such as Threads and such as Instagram. And my website is darrenfj.wordpress.com. And I'd love to carry on these conversations with listeners. That would be wonderful. So yes, hit me up.
Yes, and I will include all of this in the show notes, so don't worry. Well, thank you again, Darren, for joining us, for allowing me to continue to have conversations with you. And thank you, everyone, for listening and going behind the scenes to learn more about a playwright who, with his collaborators, really changes so much of the world and the way we know it. Thank you. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I would really appreciate it if you'd leave a rating, maybe share with a friend. It helps other people get to know us. Thank you, and please join us again as we explore how history shows us what's possible.